So welcome everybody. Welcome to our keynote. I am so delighted to have Dr. Sheila Smith here with us. And just to give a brief introduction, and then I'll hand it over to Jim and Sheila, and they're going to have an interview together on the fascinating topic of U.S.-Japan relations, which is the biggest possible part of our ecosystem of all. But Dr. Smith is a John E. Merow Senior Fellow for the Asia Pacific Studies at the Council of Foreign Relations, and she is an expert on Japanese politics and foreign policy. She is the author of Japan Renamed and Japan's New Politics and the U.S. Japan Alliance. And she's also been an author for an interactive guide on constitutional change in Japan. And she is a regular contributor to Asia Unbound and a frequent contributor to major media outlets in the United States and Asia. So I am so honored to have you here. And I'd love to turn it over to you and Jim. And please, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat, and we'll manage those questions after the formal interview part and sort of go into the Q&A phase. So have a great one, and take it away, Jim and Sheila.
Adam, thank you very much. And just a few quick words, introduction. First, myself, I'm the Executive Director Interim of U.S. JET Alumni Association. I'm also a proud alumni of the JET program, Ehime 1992 to 1994. It is a delight to be here. I want to first send a big thanks to JETAA USA. This is actually, some of you I know are joining just for this keynote session, but there's been a conference going on all day that really shows the power of the JET program community. And JETAA USA is doing a wonderful job, but I can't do this without also thanking Sasakawa USA. They've been very supportive of institutionalization in the JET community, including USJETAA and underwriting this particular session as well. So a big thanks out to Sasakawa. This is just an absolute delight and honor to be on with Dr. Sheila Smith. As Adam said, she's at the Council on Foreign Relations. For those of you who aren't policy nerds like myself, CFR, as we call it, that's really the granddaddy of think tanks. It is the most prominent in U.S. foreign policy establishment, and I'd say worldwide. Chatham House may disagree, but they're wrong on that. And Sheila leads the Japan programs there. And I find that of all of the Japan experts in DC that are really having an impact on the policy community, she's one, the most thoughtful out there. But I think even more important, she's the kindest one. So Sheila, thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Jim. And I'll be the kindest one anytime. Kindness in Washington, D.C. is a really valuable commodity, but it's a delight to be with you and with the JET alums. So looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. And what we're going to do, I thought, was interview. I'll have a conversation with Sheila for 20, 25 minutes. Think of your questions, if you can put them in the chat as we go, and we're going to try to pluck them out and ask them at the end. We'll transition to questions from everybody who's joining us. And I know we've got 46 on the line, and I think we've got 40 or 50 more who are talking about coming in. But let me show, I'm going to start off big picture here, because it's been a really disorienting 3 or 4 years. It seems we're going through an era of jarring change. You know, that when you look at the international order, the ground seems to be shifting underneath our feet here, where, you know, we see it's sort of a pitched battle of democracy versus authoritarianism. We have a major land war in Europe. We couldn't have imagined that. You know, we've been through a pandemic and are still suffering through this, and climate change and everything else. So we're at a time of massive shifts. And as we're doing this, you know, we have to rely on our allies. One of our major ones is Japan. And so I want to talk in this context here, you know, and in Asia where everything's changing, China's rising. Where is the U.S.-Japan relationship? How healthy is that?
Well, that could take an hour and a half right there, Jim. But let me, I want to focus on three pieces, right, of the relationship, because I think we often think of the U.S.-Japan relationship in this sort of alliance framework, and it's very important that we do. That's the foundation of our partnership, going all the way back to the early 1950s. But as you know, we have a new president. We had a new president who came in during the pandemic, Joe Biden, and a new team that came in that really emphasized that the United States would have to move forward strategically with its alliances, with its alliance allied partners. And first and foremost, in the Indo-Pacific, they reached out to Japan. Now, at that time, it was, of course, Prime Minister Suga, who had taken over from Prime Minister Abe. And he was the first state visitor to come, the official state visitor to come to Washington. Funny story for those of you who are not really alliance nerds like I am. He came, and of course, they were massively in the middle of the COVID pandemic, all masking, really difficult. Most of it was not about the substantive agenda of what the Prime Minister and President would talk about. It was really about COVID protocols. And last night at the Japan America Society dinner in DC, the Japanese ambassador to Washington and Kurt Campbell, who is the White House, as we call him, the Indo-Pacific czar, right? They exchanged stories about that meeting when Suga came, and that the worst and most difficult piece of diplomacy was the Japanese were really upset because there was not going to be a meal served at the White House, right? And because of COVID, right? Can't take your masks off, have to sit far away, cannot eat, right? And the Japanese side thought that was ridiculous. You cannot have a state visit without something to eat. So this is the stuff of U.S.-Japan relations at the highest level, right? And what was the compromise? A hamburger. Oh, you can imagine the storytelling last night at this Japan America Society meeting. But basically, both the ambassador and Kurt basically talked about this large hamburger that was sitting in front of the president and sitting in front of the prime minister that went uneaten. But the diplomats did their job. They had a meal and it was respectful of COVID protocols. Anyway, so our diplomacy, the thing about it is this is a very deeply familiar relationship in so many ways. And Jim knows this well. But for those of you who don't, these diplomats actually know each other through their entire careers. So the U.S.-Japan partnership is deeply engaged. People have careers engaged with Japan or on the Japanese side with the United States. So the alliance has really deep human resources, and I think it's really important. What we have, though, today is some really complex problems. And so if we start out in the security realm, clearly China, the rise of China, not just the rise of China, so not just that China has become powerful, but the way in which Chinese behavior is now challenging some of the ways in which the alliance had assumed in the post-war period it would operate. And of course, this affects Japan's own defenses. It affects the balance of power across the region, and obviously it affects American national security now that China is our pacing threat, as our military calls it, but it is our strategic competitor. So China looms large in the partnership. Subset of that, of course, is Taiwan, which we can get into in the Q&A if people are interested. The second piece, of course, is the nuclear proliferation of North Korea. And that's been going on again since the 1990s. And it is North Korea is continually improving its technologies. At any moment now, probably after the Communist Party Congress, the Party Congress, we are expecting a 7th nuclear test by the North Koreans. But all throughout this year, we've had 20 plus missile tests, right, to demonstrate the acquisition of fairly sophisticated missile technology. Very clearly a concern for Japanese security. Japan has no ballistic missiles. Lives right underneath those missiles that go shooting over the top of Japanese territory. What's happened is that the Biden administration, of course, has doubled down on the alliance, but has also joined Japan in emphasizing the Quad, which is a quadrilateral diplomatic channel with Tokyo, Washington, Canberra, so Australia, and New Delhi, India. And you've seen 4 Quad summits, some virtual, some in person, since early 2021. So this is a new framing of how to work together within the region to ensure a rules-based order. And that, I think, is very important to both the United States and Japan. finally, Jim, let me just point out that you mentioned it in your remarks, but the Russian invasion of Ukraine has also opened the door to a new diplomatic connection between the Indo-Pacific allies of the United States, Japan front and center, and the NATO allies in Europe. So in June, you saw the NATO summit in Madrid. Prime Minister Kishida was there, but as was President Yoon, the new president of South Korea, the new Prime Minister of Australia, et cetera. So you have now this expanded sense that the alliance is not just a bilateral agreement. It is a partnership that is engaging regionally, but also globally in defense of the rules-based order.
Sheila, great. That's a great way to get us started here. And my first memories of U.S. or not my first memories, I'll date myself, but when I started watching U.S.-Japan relations was the Gulf War in 1990-91. And I remember how embarrassing it was that Japan was just putting up money, not putting, blood, and, they wanted to send, they promised to transport troops and then couldn't even, Japanese airliners refused to do that. And it was a very embarrassing thing for Japan. But then you look in recent years, Japan has really taken the lead on salvaging TPP, and you didn't hear much. It was quite forward leaning, I thought, on Ukraine and standing against Russia, somewhat against Japan's own national interests, you could argue. Is this sense that Japan is more proactive, more willing to be an equal partner with the U.S. in the relationship? Is this just a holdover from the Abe era, or is this a new paradigm that we're in?
I think it's been growing slowly, Jim. And again, it's come out of that initial post-Cold War moment where the United States was really demanding that its allies step up and do more collectively in coalition activities, as you mentioned, in the Gulf. After 9/11, of course, we really expected our allies to come together with us to do things, and the Japanese refueled all kinds of maritime vessels. The Allied coalition in the Persian Gulf, a new mission for Japan. They even sent, self-defense forces to Iraq for post-conflict reconstruction. Very difficult mission for the self-defense forces, but fairly well accepted among the Japanese people, which was a surprise to me, given the early resistance to this idea. But I think it's also going beyond the military piece. I think it's also that Japanese foreign policy leaders and thinkers have watched the world accelerate, the changes accelerate. And of course, they've watched us. And, they watched us debate quite openly during the Trump administration and in the campaign that led to the presidency of Donald Trump, whether these alliances mattered to the United States or not. So it's not just that they're watching the world out there, they're also watching us very carefully, of course, because the strategic bargain that was created, 70-something years ago, is premised on the idea that the United States would provide strategic protection and Japan would engage in multilateral institutions in working through problems, whether they're economic issues or political strategic issues. So there's a kind of general evolution here, but there's also an adaptation, and that adaptation, I think, has had to accelerate, as you put it, in the wake of both the Trump administration, but also as you see the behavior of China and Russia unfold.
That's now, when you look at the relationship, what keeps you up at night? Are there, is there something? We have this closer partnership, and Japan has been it's much more of a partnership than it was before. But is there something that could tear us apart?
So sure. We all, again, all of us security folks are focused on Taiwan, the cross-straits relations, and that would be, I think, a defining challenge for the alliance. It would be a defining challenge for the United States, frankly, as it would be for Japan, because it would really open up the possibility of major power war in a real sense between the United States and China, It's very hard to think of Taiwan as a tiny little contingency that would be contained, We are now in the era where that would not be. So many people in Washington stay up at night worrying about Taiwan. I'm a little closer to, I think the US and Japan will work its way through this. And I think there's already a kind of sense of diplomatic coalition building that's going on. And again, this is where the Japanese ought to be given full credit here. It's not just that they are operating at the whim of the United States, but they are also worried about China changing the status quo in their neighborhood so fundamentally. And of course, it would challenge the alliance fundamentally, right? If there was a use of force against Taiwan by the People's Republic of China. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but it's a worst case scenario. But you've seen the Japanese talk to Europeans, talk to Canada, become much more engaged in helping to build that coalition that says the world needs to stand up. This is not just an Asian problem or Indo-Pacific problem. And it's not just, in my view, a problem the US and Japan can solve alone. And so Japan's diplomatic heft is something we often don't recognize fully, but we should, because it's part and parcel of that. The thing that keeps me up at night, and you won't be surprised to hear this, is the future of the U.S.-Japan partnership. Not because I think we're going to disagree with each other, but because I've reached the point maybe in my career, and I'm revealing my age probably, where I worry about the next generation. Like, who's coming? Who is going to support this relationship and make sure it continues to be close, or that it becomes even closer and more constructive in helping to solve the world's problems?
And that's a really important point. I think it relates to, the audience on this call is largely JET alumni. Before diving too deep into this, though, what are really the future needs? You've talked about military issues, but and security issues, but are there issues that you need the younger people to be focusing on now?
Well, I think the skill set that we're going to need is going to be diverse, and it's going to need to be adaptive. And I think that word is something I'll come back to over and over again. And, the large sort of world that thinks about human resources and problem solving, right, talks about 21st century skill sets, right? So what my son is 22, and I'm sure he's a little younger than this audience, but is going to need to have a variety of skills that probably me, obviously, but maybe even you, Jim, didn't have to think about in terms of our career development. And so whether that's information technology, the ability to adapt to other kinds of technological applications, that piece of the job market, right, is really pretty important. And so I think there's a general, whether it's a U.S.-Japan context or beyond, this is a different market, so to speak, for skills. And I think what we're coming around to understanding, though, is that the ability to work together collaboratively, to work together in teams, to bring skills to a place where you can encourage and produce work in collaboration with others is far more important today. Across different fields, I think, than it's ever been in the past. So that's one piece. I think global knowledge, trans-border, transnational ability to work across different cultural contexts, to work across different global environments, I think is also really, really important. And so that's, again, speaks specifically to the JET team. But I think in the U.S.-Japan partnership, we have a broader relationship today, perhaps a more comprehensive relationship today than we've had in the past. You know this well, but we work together in global health. We work together in all dimensions of medical health, right, related fields. We have scientific engagement, we have public policy engagement, but so too do we work together, and do we try to work separately on climate change related issues, on this question of renewable technologies, the application of these technologies. So we have a whole host of areas where we work together that don't often fall under the rubric of U.S.-Japan, but they are fundamental to the direction that both of our countries want to go. I love the story of a little bit older, I think, than the listeners, but there's a young political scientist who was going along the same path as me in Japan, and decided he didn't really want to have a PhD in political science. And he just happened to have a friend in Japan who was interested in conservation, and in turn, especially household conservation. So they put their heads together and figured out ways that Japanese households could figure out what kind of energy use they were using in their houses. And then at the end of the day, that little venture between two people who are friends, smart friends, obviously, ended up being purchased by Oracle, and he, moved on to this other kind of career. So I think there's lots of opportunity for innovative collaboration in the U.S. Japan partnership. And it's not just the government to government relationship, but obviously the private sector, in civil society, right, in science. So I think there's no limits really on what we might be able to find niches for in working with partners in Japan.
Good. And I know this may be a little bit out of the area that you usually focus on, but I want to ask you a little bit about where you could see JET alumni contributing. And, you know, international relations comes down to people's relationships with one another and their expertise. And I know these JET alumni are developing this global knowledge you spoke about. But just, I want to guess, what role do they have to play in meeting these future needs?
So I think the thing is to think about your Japan expertise, not just as your only identity, but as something you couple with whatever else it is that motivates you, right? Whatever other skill set or experience you're developing. That piece of coupling the Japan expertise with your professional skill set, I think is really important, because it gives you both the ability to move back and forth between US and Japanese, right, efforts, but it also gives you the ability to bring in a problem-solving mindset, whatever that may be. Now, the one thing I will say about JET alums, every one of them that I have met, is they go on to do amazing things. And so the question is whether you would if you want to continue to stay in the Japan field, the network that you're building and that Jim is helping you build is perfect. Because what that helps you do, as you're doing today, is bring in people from the U.S.-Japan relationship, get to know them, what's out there, but also on the other side, ask them for help. Use what you've learned or the people that you've met and say, what can I do? This is my interest. You seem to be interested in the same thing as me. Write to them. Because here's the thing, all of you are spread out around the country. You've gone to Japan. You've had this intense experience in Japan, and then you come home and then you go, now what do I do? And so tapping into the network that's beyond wherever you're physically residing is really, really important. And that's, again, why this is such an amazing network, Jim, to be focusing on. I do think it takes time to develop a career. And I think that's something, especially for younger people, to recognize that I didn't start out thinking I would do the work that I do today. I hadn't even imagined that this kind of a job existed. And so be aware that as you develop your skills, whatever they may be, there will be new opportunities developing along with you. And so it's not necessarily that you should get yourself ready for job X that already exists, but that you should build your own skill set that you can bring to whatever opportunities you see ahead of you, right? I don't know what the U.S. Japan job market is going to look like in 20 or 30 years, right? But you will also be creating it. And I think that's the agency I'd like all of you to take on board, is it's not like there's something out there that you have to conform and get ready for. It's that you, at the end of the day, will help build some of those new opportunities as you go.
Great. And while you're talking, there have been questions pouring in here. And I encourage more people, keep putting them into the chat. And I'm going to take them out of order, but I think you started to talk about your own career, and one relates to that. Is what is the most rewarding experience you've had in U.S.-Japan relations?
That's another, there's too many stories to tell when you get to be my age. but the other thing, when you're my age and you look back, your career looks very linear. It looks like it all made sense. When it was happening, it didn't make sense at all. I didn't know what was ahead. There was, what I mean? So again, but there's some very early experiences, and this may also be shared by many of you who've been in Japan. But I lived with a Japanese family for about 6 months when I first landed. I studied Japanese at Sophia University, for those of you who don't know me. So I did an intensive Japanese language and culture program, and then I came back to the United States and went to Columbia, and the rest is history. I ended up with a PhD from Columbia in political science and East Asia. And I was lucky because I had the faculty there were amazing. But in terms of education, I think it was less about the substantive. I was very interested in Japan and Buddhism and all kinds of things. I did all kinds of things when I was younger because it's fascinating to me. But it is the relationships that I built with Japanese people that were critical to me, not necessarily in terms of career advancement or specific to career, but what kept me coming back to Japan was that homestay family, that closeness, those friends. And so I think that's one of the things as you leave your experience in Japan, don't leave those friendships behind. And it takes a little bit more effort. Well, now you have Zoom and other opportunities, but keep that going because, you know, any career that you have, it's the human connection, right? It's the relationships that you build. And if it had just been about professional experiences, I would not be a Japan specialist today, to be honest with you, because some of it was like knocking my head against the wall. I mean, if some of it was just hard. And you know, you don't want to hear those stories, but we can try that another day. But I think the things that you enjoy and love and what resonates with you about Japan, those are the things that are going to keep you coming back. Because those are the things intellectually that make you engaged. Those are the relationships that make you feel like it matters and you have a connection. And that's the one piece. I will tell a very funny story, which is not about me, but my Japanese father at the homestay family was quite a bit older than my parents. And he was the second to last group that were going to go off and be kamikaze in the Imperial Navy. So he was a young 14-year-old cadet in the Imperial Navy when the war ended. My father was in the U.S. Navy a generation later, right? My dad didn't fight in World War II. He was a post-war guy, was fighting the Cold War, not the other war. But I lived with them, and my father came to Tokyo for business, for something else, and I asked him to come and say thank you to the family for putting up with me, putting me up, and he did. And of course, it was a very typical Japanese house. And Mr. Kuruba, the father of the family, was not a very tall man, let's just put it that way. And my father was 6'5". And so we were in this tiny little room, and many of you know setsuma, right? In the old-fashioned Japanese houses are tiny. And there was a 6'5" American and this maybe 5-foot Japanese man and me interpreting between the two of them. And it was the most magical thing in a way, because Mr. Kuruba said, "I'm so sorry for what we did in Pearl Harbor." And my father was so taken aback because he didn't know what to do, like to refer to the war for him. And he's like, "Well, I'm very sorry for everything we've did afterwards." So he couldn't quite bring himself to say anything about Hiroshima or Nagasaki. And then they both kind of looked at each other and they chuckled. And my father said, "We read everything about what you guys did at the academy," right? So then they went on to this Navy guy to Navy guy conversation. But it was so interesting to me that my Japanese father had to say that first to my father, and that my father needed to recognize that he also needed to apologize, not as a diplomatic apology, but as a person-to-person, right, kind of exchange. And I found those kinds of exchanges, not just about the war, obviously, but so many of the interactions I had in Japan were about trying to get beyond our history in a way, trying to get beyond the barriers and make sure that those connections between us were strong. And I think that's just such a value for the partnership. And that's the thing you guys all need to continue for us, please.
Sheila, and that's wonderful. And it reminds us, it wasn't that long ago that, our fathers were trying to kill our friends' fathers. It's
right.
History. It's a very short period of time.
Generations, right?
Yes. I'm going to jump around with some of the questions here and mix and match and combine them, if I hope people don't mind here, but there are a couple on soft power. And I think what you're talking about, your host's father and your father meeting sort of talks to that a little bit, or at least a good segue into it. And one of them really is about how U.S. and Japan and CETA, Cultural Alliance, Soft Power Alliance, what kind of power that has around the world. And then a second related point is more just about Japan's soft power in Africa, where, of course, there's jockeying between China and Japan and many others. And how do you see that playing out? And of course, is there a role for jets in that? It's sort of the third component of the question. So
the soft power, I like the soft power, concept, because it helps us keep out of just solely thinking about our relations to other global powers in terms of military power or economic power, or so hard power, right? And I think the cultural piece, especially for the U.S. and Japan, has been so fascinating. So, I would start off, if I hadn't told you the story about the reconciliation with my dad and my Japanese homestay father, but reconciliation is one of the soft power accomplishments of the United States and Japan. And I think you saw that. I was here in Washington when President Obama and his team were trying to prepare the ground with Japanese colleagues for his historic visit to Hiroshima. And then obviously Prime Minister Abe, followed up with his visit to Pearl Harbor. I think that was powerful in many ways because again, this cross-generational, voices and cross-generational experience in that moment. But there was also the context of that as we looked at China and South Korea having difficulty with Japan on this question of reconciliation in the past. So I'm not saying that our example changed the minds of South Korea and China, but I do think our ability with Japan to demonstrate the partnership across this, history is really, really important. And I think that cross-generational influence has been really, really striking to me. The other is a big macro, and that's the East-West, right? Because culturally, again, I don't necessarily buy into all of the Orientalist kind of philosophy here, but I think that a power like Japan that rose to preeminence globally in the 20th century, at the same time that this North American power, i.e. the United States, rose to power, right? These are two non-European powers and cultures that really transformed, not always positively, okay, but they really transformed what we think of as a global world, right? It wasn't global through imperialism, it was a different kind of influence, but I do think it's been all the way through that 20th century. You can see the way that Japanese soft power in the cultural, artistic, right, way that it influenced Europe. I went to so many museums when I was in France studying French. I saw so much of that in French museums and French cultural artifacts of that era. So I think the cultural piece, the arts, the expression of identity through the arts has been also a large part of our bridging of different kinds of cultural expression in the world. And I think that's a very powerful thing as well. The other is, I guess, the Africa question is interesting to me because it comes out of a very specific place where Japanese influence might be felt. I'm not sure it's all soft power, to be quite honest with you, in Africa, because Japan brings considerable economic resources as well as technological capability to that influence. But I do think it's an interesting moment where Japan can position itself, and that China is one example of the expression of Asian power, but Japan is a different one. And so I think that's a more subtle question. It's an interesting question. And I think it's one that we should watch. And those of you who have experience either in Africa observing that or in Japan watching how Japanese actors, private and public sector actors, express Japanese influence in Africa, it's a very interesting question. For the jets, I think you have invested in a skill of understanding and bridging both American experience and Japanese experience. I think you probably can see the differences in the way we express our soft power. In many ways, Japan has resisted the hard power, right? The utility of hard power. I think today's Japan is beginning to appreciate more the need for an expression of hard power globally, but nonetheless, through popular culture, through the ambition or aspiration of maintaining a peaceful ambition for their own nation, I think Japan models a kind of behavior that is very beneficial around the world. Whether it's going to end up being, listened to by other powers, I don't know. But I think you guys are all able to express and explore some of the values of the way the Japanese have chosen to express their power. And I think that's one of the pieces for the JETs. It's really important. Now, whether you're interested in the arts, whether you're interested, if you're interested in popular culture or film or I don't, any of those, the more, the better, I think, for the arts, I think. But what's really important is your ability to translate and to contextualize and to compare Japan's expression of its power. I think it's a very important skill.
Let me just seize on a word. I mean, you mentioned values too. And this is, I get the sense it's a growing thing, growing importance in U.S.-Japan relations. It's not just about interests of values, whether democracy or freedom and openness. And how do you explain that, or how do you see that evolving?
So I think, there's so many ways in which we talk about post-war Japan. I teach a course on Japanese domestic politics, and so you're going to hear a little bit of my mind coming out of that class this semester. What I have my students do is explore this question: is Japan really a democracy, or does it just look like a democracy? How do we understand democratic practice in Japan as opposed to Europe, Israel, right? The United States, other democratic nations? How do we weigh culture through the institutions and the mechanics of democracy? And I think what's very interesting is you hear the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Japanese diplomats emphasize values, right? Value-based diplomacy. Former Prime Minister Abe was very good at that. What did Japan stand for? And he, again, he was not so good at it vis-a-vis some of his domestic critics at home. But on the world stage, he was very comfortable talking about what Japan stood for, the values, as Jim pointed out: freedom, democracy, right? Free and open Indo-Pacific, right? Transparency. So I think he was probably the most articulate statesman of the values approach to Japanese diplomacy. But I think it was implicit in Japanese diplomacy up till that point. I think he understood that the time had come for Japan to be very clear about its values on the international stage. And I think that's one of the hallmarks of Abe's statecraft. Now, I think you also have to think about some of the expressions of value, some of the values that we're seeing that are contested at home. And I think you see that in every democracy, whether it's here in the United States or in Japan. There's always in a democracy a push, right, for recognition of social change and recognition for equality and representation. And you have that tension in Japan in the same way you have it in every other democracy. But thinking about Japan as a vibrant democracy, I think, is not always obvious to most of my students when they come into the class until we start talking about protest, social movements, right? Different expressions, use of the courts, challenges of constitutionality. So Japan's own democracy, I think, is one of its greatest selling points abroad. And it's not something necessarily we can package into a diplomatic speech, but it is the behavior within Japan in the demonstration of an active democracy that I think makes Japan a beacon of sorts in Asia at large.
And it's been incredible how stable and responsive it is in many ways. I'm going to jump right, because now that everybody's revved up, they're getting the more difficult questions for you. And I'm going to, one here is, do you have an opinion, and this is getting outside of U.S.-Japan relations, so forgive us here, an opinion why the U.S. is not trying to broker peace between Russia and Ukraine? And I'll take the prerogative of interviewing you to kind of expand that, because in Japan, you hear some talk that, Japan could be an intermediary between the U.S. and China, and you used to hear that, vis-a-vis the Middle East as well. But do you have a general sense on either one in the alliance relying on the other one is brokering international relations?
There's a lot of emphasis in Japanese diplomacy. Given my experience, as Jim pointed out, goes back to the first Gulf War. So I've been listening for a long time to Japanese foreign policy thinkers, practitioners, and this idea that Japan can mediate between East and West, or between the United States and Iran, for example, right? I think there are many people who feel that Japan can play that bridging role. Not always obvious to American policymakers why Japan is the right bridge, But I will say in the Iran-Iraq war, for example, there were some ways in which the Japanese were able to do things that we could not. Can they broker peace? Probably not. And that again goes back to what you think the causes of the tension really are. And I think in some ways with Iran, as those of you who may have followed the talks over Iranian acquisition of nuclear weapons, right? And these are interests that collide, and it's not just the US, it's also the Europeans, right? And so Japan has a little bit less leverage on some of those. The other is Japan has not really been willing to use leverage. So being a mediator means that you try to take a neutral stance and you communicate a message. Switzerland is very good at this. Switzerland is very effective at this, but Switzerland doesn't try to leverage its own power. It is a conduit. It is a go-between, right? Japan, remember, for much of the last 30 years was the second largest global economy. Japan, nothing to sneeze at in terms of hard power. It's just how it chooses to use that power. But Japan's economic exposure also meant using those levers had serious consequences. And so there was a real resistance by Tokyo to getting into that game, so to speak, that it didn't want to become that kind of balance of power advocate. And so it has tried to define places, multilateral engagement, multilateral institutions, to try actually to diffuse its own hard power in a way, in pursuing its interests. I think on the Russia-Ukraine, I don't know that Japan, what's been interesting to me about Japanese foreign policy, and then I'll shift to the US side, but is how different Japan's reaction was from 2014 when the Russians annexed Crimea. And in there are two reasons for that. One, the Abe cabinet was deeply engaged and focused on diplomacy with Vladimir Putin, right, on trying to get to a peace treaty and to neutralize and move Russia away, if you will, from its growing close relationship with China. So there were real geostrategic interests at stake in that diplomacy, and the prime minister did not want to challenge that by engaging in the G7 sanctions. It did some visa. It stopped visas and things like that, but really did not do what Prime Minister Kishida did this year with the invasion. I think this year the Russian behavior was far more egregious. And I think for Japan and Prime Minister Kishida in particular, the idea that you let a country off the hook for that level of aggression was unacceptable, because you bring that home to the Indo-Pacific. And what does that say? Well, that means you allow China to do the same thing on Taiwan, or you allow another country to cross sovereign boundaries and use force. So I think Japan was as rattled as we were all by Russia's decision to launch a ground war against Ukraine. But I also think they understood that over the long term, Japanese national interest required standing up for the rule of law and for the post-war norm of condemning that kind of violence. Whether the United States can get in the middle and negotiate, I think our job, to be quite honest with you, is to make sure that NATO is prepared for any further broadening of the conflict. In other words, to deter Russian aggression from any further seepage to the Baltic states or to Poland. To NATO is right there. And there is a security obligation, a codified treaty of Article 5 protections that would engage the United States in any attack on a NATO ally. Ukraine, of course, is not one of those. And for better or for worse, President Biden said from the outset that there would be no American boots on the ground. However, we have certainly made it possible for Ukraine to fight back. And so we have a little bit of a situation that looks a little bit like what we do with Taiwan, which is provide the weapons and capabilities for Ukraine to defend itself. But I don't think we are in a position with Moscow to act as a neutral intermediary. So I think it's interesting the role that Turkey is playing, for example. There's some really interesting, there was some really interesting early diplomacy by Israel. So there were countries that could perhaps speak to both sides with credibility. I don't think the United States would have credibility in Moscow.
Thank you. That's really astute. And I'm going to ask, I think that the moderators, the chairs have given us permission to go on about 10 minutes longer to 6 o'clock. I know it's not 5:50 yet, but we're getting some great questions in here. But just on this, the Russia piece there, do you see any daylight now between the United States and Japan on Russia?
Sorry, that's me. My phone is off.
Yeah.
Sorry.
The White House calling?
No, it's my son. Almost the White House. Almost as important. So I think, yeah, the person on the line wants to answer the question. I apparently did not persuade my son by hanging up on him. You may want to listen to a mother telling her son to call back in just a second if it happens again. Somebody really wants an answer. So sorry, I got blanked out.
Right. And I was asking, is there any daylight between the U.S. and Japan on Russia now? Because it was pretty obvious in 2014 that we were going somewhat diverging.
So I think the interesting thing is, for me, first of all, Kishida came out very fast.
Yeah.
And just so everybody understands, that was not the Ministry of Foreign Affairs telling him what to do. It actually emanated from the Prime Minister himself.
It was important.
It was important. He saw it. It was important. That was there. It was done. Did he do it just because of the alliance with the United States? No, he didn't. But that was also in his calculations, I'm sure. I don't think in the G7 generally, Jim, you see much daylight. I think when the G7 came together initially, they understood that this was the UN Security Council was not working, obviously, because the Russians were in chairing. So this was then going to be the venue through which the international response of opposition to Putin's war was going to be funneled. And I think there was a very early commitment that this had to be effective and it had to be consensus driven. So, and I don't think there was a lot of dissonance. I think it's not dissonance so much as it was different kinds of capabilities that each could bring to bear. And even among the NATO allies or the Europeans and Canada and others in the G7, you saw some difference in terms of the size of the assistance to Ukraine, because there's two pieces, right? There's the sanctioning of Russia, and then there's the assistance to Ukraine. And the sanctioning of Russia, they worked out quite nicely so that they would stay in the same ballpark, right? That you wouldn't reveal dissonance, because the messaging to Putin had to be unified and clear. And that was very early on one of the premises of whatever decision we make, we have to be in lockstep, right? So that there is no daylight. So I think they've been very effective on that. The only place where you see the dissonance, of course, is on energy, and European, in particular Germany, right? But Germany, and Chancellor Scholz came out very fast to try, at least rhetorically, to say Germany would keep pace. Now they've got domestic politics like every other country, and they did the best they could, even moving up on the energy piece as well. And Putin tried to put serious pressure on the Germans, and the Germans responded by, no, we're not going to take it, right? But there were gradients on the energy flow and how quickly people were expected to move. That's the one place, and that was really intra-European. Japan's, as you know, energy engagement with Russia is up in Sakhalin, in the Sakhalin 2 project. And there, of course, there's a consortium of investors. So that too remains on the docket, but that's not an area where the Biden administration sees the Japanese as really breaking away. They see it as a particularly reasonable set of policies. And Kishida did move on the gas after it was demonstrated that there were war crimes or war crimes equivalent. Ukraine. He said, okay, that's it. We'll cut gas. We won't stop Sakhalin 2, but we'll start to stop some of our hard purchases. So I think you're seeing Japanese keep up in a way. Keep up is probably the wrong terminology here, but very much in the mix of not only imposing sanction, but of defining the scope of assistance and in defining the way in which these levers would be used. So I think it's a really interesting case study for any of you thinking of a PhD in political science. This is prime territory. It's really interesting.
Yeah, it's been fascinating to see. And I think for those of us who watch it, it comes as a surprise. Now, I'm going to pivot, but not too far here. You have a question that really plays to your strength. I know you're doing a project on the Japanese Constitution And this one, initially starts talking about a standing army. Of course, Japan has a standing army, but how they can act is the question, and so this question is, do you see constitutional amendment on the horizon, and particularly tied in, to prepare for a contingency in the Taiwan Straits?
Okay. So there's a really interesting book on your bookshelf, Jim.
Yes, yeah.
That would help.
Going off for those of you who...
So for those of you who are actually interested in the kind of politics of military policymaking, I recommend a book by Sheila Smith because that's what that book is designed to do, is to help you see what has changed. And I run through 4 different aspects of military policy. One is how the SDF are sent abroad and why, which is new in the post-Cold War era. The other is how they're mobilizing to defend Japan in this new, deteriorating military balance in and around Japan. One of the chapters is all about the constitutional revision piece, but and then the other chapter is about the strategic dependence on the United States. But the constitutional, just to point out a fact, Japan has done all of these changes, and remember, Japan is in the top 10 globally in terms of spending or investing in its military power. So many people think they don't have a military, or they have a joke of a military, or they don't really have any military power, and that is absolutely wrong. And what it is that they use that investment in military power for a circumscribed role for their military, which began as territorial defense and now is increasingly becoming, because of technological change and challenge from new technologies that adversaries have, they're beginning to merge into more broad domains, space, maritime, cyber, where offense, defense is not really easily discriminated between. But technicalities aside, we can talk technicalities more if you'd like, but Japan is a significant military power. It has simply chosen not to use that instrument of statecraft in a way that might be misconstrued by its neighbors, or that might temper the idea, especially across Asia, that Japan in the post-war period wants to settle its disputes peacefully. So it is also a way to address the historical legacy of the pre-war period and the imperial period, that Japan is going to use economic levers, it's going to use cultural levers, social levers, diplomatic levers, but not military levers to influence its interests abroad. Today, I would say that's beginning to change. And I think what you see today across the Indo-Pacific is the Japanese military is one of many ways in which Japan demonstrates its peaceful desire to build coalitions with like-minded countries. So you see the Maritime Self-Defense Forces, for example, they sent ships to the Solomon Islands after the Chinese had been inviting the Solomons to create a special strategic pact with them. They engage with Pacific Islands, with New Zealand, with Australia, Singapore. And those of you who know your World War II history know one of the deepest legacies of antagonism was in Singapore because of the imperial invasion, imperial Japanese invasion of Singapore. So you have a lot of Southeast Asia today seeing a very different Japan. And you also see, of course, in Northeast Asia, the desire to present a more sturdy Japan so that potential adversaries won't miscalculate Japanese intent if others decide to use force against them. So that's a long-winded, but hopefully full answer to that question. But this year is a particularly good year to be watching Japan because it's about to make decisions that I think are going to be fairly significant. They're going to probably increase their defense budget by anywhere from 10 to 20% annually over the next 5 years. There'll be a fight inside Japan, inside the Japanese government for that budget, but I think there's some signaling coming out of Japan on how much it's going to improve its military capabilities. And then the second way is there's going to be a decision about getting offensive weaponry. And that may not be this year, maybe next year, but it's coming. And it's conventional, it's not nuclear. But the idea is that Japan is the only country now in Northeast Asia that doesn't have ballistic missiles, doesn't have conventional strike capability. And so for deterrence, it's probably a blank spot the Japanese should fill in.
So does Japan doesn't need to change its constitution? Is that what we should take away?
Oh, sorry. Yes. To get back to the Constitution. Yes, that all of this has been done with no revision of the Japanese constitution.
Great, great. So I know we're getting near the end here. You have two more questions, very much related that I'll say three questions here. I'm just going to put them together. One that was presented in a way that I can't resist here. One is really on civil society piece, which is near and dear to my heart. One for JET alumni, are there civil society organizations outside of JETAA? And it could be Japan America Society, sister cities, that they should be paying attention to, getting involved in. Two, I hope I'm not putting too much on your plate here. Are there any Japan-US sort of civil society partnerships that you see, outside of those really in the international relations field that we should be paying attention to? And I don't know if this is on climate change, health, et cetera. And then I'll come back with that final question in a second.
Okay, on the civil society, there's all kinds of ways in which local groups, so local politicians, local communities actually reach out. I think one of the areas where we're kind of interested in getting a little bit more knowledge is in the sister city relationships. And the reason for that is there's been increasing research done on the sister city relationships. And during the pandemic, the sister city relationships, interestingly enough, were the places where problems were solved, because mayors, executives, municipal leaders needed help thinking through problems and reaching out back and forth, right? During the pandemic was one way in which they could compare notes, right? And these sister cities were kind of, formulas, right? There was a nice relationship before the pandemic. People went back and forth. There were local officials, there were businesses and things like that. But during the pandemic, those ties that had been created, those connections that had been created, could then be used to speak to each other about, well, how are you handling this problem? And I think that's one of the areas that I think there's a really renewed interest and a renewed sense of value of these, what some people were thinking of as sort of old-fashioned, sister city relations. But now they're becoming quite dynamic at the local municipal city level. And they're not only U.S. Japan, but they're also Japan and Asia, U.S. Japan and Asia. So I think there's lots of space for those sister city relationships to take on a kind of media role, if you will, in terms of thinking through common shared problems. It doesn't have to be just the pandemic. It can be the hollowing out of rural areas and things like that, health, climate, renewable resources, et cetera. So it's exchanging best practices and thought processes. And I think that's really valuable. I think in almost every, we don't talk about it much. And again, this is an area where I'm a little curious, but not necessarily fully empirically aware. So I'll just put it out there for you to think about. And that is professional associations. So whether it's lawyers, engineers, disaster management specialists, and especially after the 2011 Great East Japan earthquake. I was on a task force the United States sent that included the police officer, the police head of the police in Louisiana, New Orleans, who managed the response to Katrina. So we have now a fairly robust conversation back and forth on the civil society side with local governments, but also these kinds of disaster management specialists and the non-governmental organizations that are mobilized around the globe, Mercy Corps, other organizations like that. So when we have a problem like that, it generates an opportunity for that kind of civil society expertise and organizational capacity to be brought together. And I think disaster management is another area where the U.S. and Japan have developed that bridge. But that just goes to show you that we share an awful lot of the same problems. I mean, Jim keeps mentioning climate change, right? Disasters, right? Anybody been in Japan the last 5 to 10 years? I mean, it has really gotten pummeled by weather, by sea level change, things like that. But there's a lot of ways in which these kind of problems that we all face need the expertise, not necessarily of national governments or academics, but of other local governments and other kinds of special organizations. So I think there's a lot of ways in which the civil society piece can be strengthened.
That's great, Sheila. I'm going to get in trouble with Adam, who has to close us down here, but I'm going to put one more question because I can't refuse because it's labeled question from high school student.
I saw that. That's excellent. Good.
What are your predictions on the future U.S. Japan Alliance? And I do hope JET alumni have a role in that.
Right. So I think I am optimistic, largely because I work in organizations dedicated to the U.S. Japan partnership, like Colcon and the Japan U.S. Friendship Commission. I think you heard from Paige Cottingham Streeter earlier today. We believe in this partnership, and we believe that it is you who are going to carry us forward in this partnership. And I think it's just because it's a natural, it is the history of our partnership is so rich. And the value that Japanese people and American people put on this relationship is incredibly high. And, you know, again, you can take our dark moments and you can see it in the polling, you can see it in the behavioral response. We care about each other, even if we don't necessarily go and become a JET. But, you know, look at the fundraising that happened in the United States after the 2011 earthquake. And these were people who may have had no connection with Japan, but Japan was our friend. And I think it is that investment that needs people like you to continue to demonstrate the value of that friendship. And because there's a lot of Americans and there are a lot of Japanese who don't get the opportunity to actually experience the depth of that relationship. And so if you do nothing else in the Japan field, and I'm sure all of you will do something else, especially our high school student who asked the question, it is the small things that we all do. It is the friendships that we all have. It is the investment in time to continue those friendships and relationships. And it's the seeking out of the opportunity to expand the partnership. Bring your own sense of what the partnership can do next to whatever it is that you do, because we're all relying on you guys to carry us forward. Our generation did certain things because we had the Japan of the 1980s. We had the trade wars. We had the moments where people were thinking, oh, this is not an alliance. This is an adversarial relationship. So you will have to navigate the world, and you'll have to navigate the particular stresses and strains of the U.S.-Japan partnership, and there will be stresses and strains, but you'll navigate it with the same spirit. I hope that has been navigated all the way through, because this is too valuable to the United States. This partnership is way too valuable to us to let it diminish, to let it weaken. And I think it's just one of these things where we find a way to make sure that it's strong every day. And I am very confident that you guys will carry all this forward.
Thank you. I'm going to hand off to Adam to take us across the finish line. Let me say this has been fun. This has been fascinating. I've learned a lot. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely fantastic. And thank you for your faithfulness to contribute to the U.S.-Japan relationship as well. I really appreciate your time and all the perspective you could bring to us, and help us think bigger than just the time we spend in our chapters and on our alumni boards, and that there's something for us when we decide to make the next step. So thank you again so much for your time, and we really appreciate it. So for everybody still in the room, oh, did you have a closing?
Adam, I just wanted to, I forgot to advertise something that I'd like to advertise, and Paige
please go ahead.
may have advertised it already, but we have Thank you, Jim. It wasn't that, but there is a website called Nichibei Connect that the Japan U.S. Friendship Commission has started. And what it does is help you meet a whole bunch of people from very different fields who plays a huge role in the U.S.-Japan partnership. It helps you understand career trajectories, but it also hopefully will give you some avenues to think about mentorship if you need it. All right, so go to Nichibei Connect if you can.
Thank you.
Thank you
so much. And what a wonderful way to almost conclude day one. So while the formal part of the conference is ending, there is a coffee cafe room that people are welcome to go to and hang out in. Of course, no